Job chapter 4. We're going to try to look at more of Job tonight than we have so far throughout our studies. Tonight we're going to try to look at chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. Of course, not in depth, covering that much material. But I want us to get a big theme tonight from these chapters. And as you who have read the book of Job many times understand and know that it appears in the book of Job, when you read it, a lot of the material is repeated and repeated and repeated. When you get to his friends and they're talking, they're going back and forth and arguing, you may say, but these speeches that are given, a lot of the same material is covered. So we are going to look at one in particular tonight. And what I want us to see tonight is, and we looked at it just somewhat briefly last week, but I want us to look tonight at the need to give compassion to the people who are despairing. When you find someone in despair, whether emotionally, physically, spiritually, intellectually, they're in despair, a despairing person calls for mercy and compassion. That's what Job is going through. And his friends here fail him terribly. I've been listening to a book recently. I'm just into it a little ways. But it's about some of the horrible things that happened in the Soviet Union. Just some of the terrible, terrible things. Torture, murders, millions and millions and millions of people dying because of this, under Joseph Stalin and so forth. And as I listened just some to the stories of the torture, I mean, honestly, I listened to the way they tortured people, what they did. It's horrific. But you begin to think to yourself, where did these people come up with this stuff at? Where do you come up with how to torture people to get them to sign a document? Where do people come up with all these different schemes to get someone to confess to something they've never done before? And there's different answers to that, of course. But as I've listened to that and as I've studied and looked at the book of Job, the ultimate answer is this. It comes from Satan, doesn't it? It comes from Satan. You see this in the way that Satan deals with Job. In one sense, Satan is torturing Job, is what he's doing. The whole point, it's not the whole point. The whole point is to dishonor God. We know, the reader knows, but Job doesn't know. The reader knows there's something happening in heaven that Job knows nothing about. The reason that Job has been tried and tested so much is not because he's unrighteous. The reason he's been tempted and tested so much is because he is the most righteous man. And God is testing him because he is righteous. Maybe for you here, you can think back in your life, none of us are sinful. Job is not sinful. Job is not sinless, I should say. None of us are sinless. Job is not sinless. And yet maybe you can think back in your life, you're living for the Lord, you're loving the Lord, and something terrible happens. Well, maybe God allowed that to happen because you were righteous. And God was testing you. And we don't know what's happening behind the scenes. But we know something's happening in heaven, and the devil's main point with Job is to get him to say, basically, I curse God, I don't care about Him, I reject God. That is the devil's purpose in all of this, for Job at least. And what does the devil do to Job? First of all, he takes his wealth away, he takes servants away, he takes his children away. And that's the same thing for his wife too. And then the devil takes his health away. Terrible. We'll read some tonight about the terrible health problems that Job had. And then instead of taking Job's wife away, the devil uses Job's wife against him. And if that wasn't bad enough, now Job cannot die. He wants to die. And maybe some of you have even felt this way before. Maybe we've had some family members or relatives who have felt this way. They're going through such struggle, they just ask God, if you will take my life now, please do. And they pray something like that. And they mean that. Job is there at one point in his life. He wants to be taken away. He's still there at the verses and chapters we're going to see. But not only does the devil turn Job's wife against him, the devil turns his friends against him. Now, here's the point that really got me thinking about torture, is that it's not only that he has one friend turn against him. The friends think they're actually doing good. He's got 3 friends. And not only are these 3 friends speaking wrong to him, they're falsely accusing him. And not only are they falsely accusing him, this goes on and on and on and on in the book of Job. This is the main part of this long book, are his friends falsely accusing Job, speaking the words of the devil to Job, taking Scripture and twisting Scripture, all the while they think they're doing Job a service and they think they're loving him. On one level, this is torture. And this is the schemes of the devil that he has here for Job. Let's jump in. We're going to look at chapter 4. We're not going to look at every verse. But let's begin. This is the first friend who begins to speak in the book of Job. His name is Eliphaz. Eliphaz probably is the oldest of the 3 friends. He's the one that speaks first. And if you remember, at the very end of the book, there's a 4th friend who waited to the very end to speak, and because he was younger than all the other ones. So no doubt Job lived in a culture and a time where age was very important and very much respected. Eliphaz here is probably the wisest and the eldest of his 3 friends. And we know, back in chapter 2, that his 3 friends did not come to him to hurt him at all. They came out of good motives. They loved Job. They came to him. They wept with him. They wept when they saw him. And they sat for 7 days without saying a word because of their love for Job and their heartbreaking for the situation that Job was in. That was the only good thing his friends did for Job. That's the only good thing he did. Have you ever had a friend that you knew that he or she loved you, and yet they had given you some terrible advice before? Well, here is friends like this. Eliphaz, his main point is this: whoever perished while they were innocent. That's the main point. And in one sense, maybe that's the main point of all the friends' speech in this book. You could sum it up by saying this. They would say, Job, hey, we love you, Job. But you know what? If you really loved God, and if you really cared for Him and lived for Him, you wouldn't be going through this, Job. God doesn't let this kind of stuff happen to the righteous, Job. Job, why don't you repent and get your heart right? Let's start here in chapter 4. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered. He begins well here overall. If one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? Now remember, this is not a man after Job. This is a man who may have tears in his eyes. Who knows? He really loves Job. If one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Behold, you have admonished many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have helped the tottering to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees. Now comes verse 5. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. How would you like someone to say that to you, even if it was true? How would you like someone just to bluntly, even in a gentle way, say, after maybe just a few weeks after your kids have died, your wealth is gone, your health is gone, your wife has turned her back on you, and now you're sitting on ashes, scraping the pus off your skin. How would you like someone to come to you and say, you know, you're really impatient? You know that? What would you think about that? This man thinks he's doing well. He thinks he's doing good. And here's the main point, verse 6. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Don't you trust in the fact that you're a righteous man, Job? Remember now whoever perished, being innocent. Whoever died as an innocent man. God wouldn't do that, Job. God is just. He wouldn't punish innocent people. Or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. Job's lost everything. Now his friends are saying to him, it's really your fault after all, Job. We love you. That's why we're speaking the truth to you. Job, just admit your sin and get it over with. Just admit your sin, Job. Be done with it. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of His anger they come to an end. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the fierce lion and the teeth of the young lions are broken. It doesn't matter how powerful a person is. When God comes, they're broken. Job, you're broken. You've sinned against God. Job, just admit to it. Just admit to it, Job. Look down in verse 12. This is the confirmation of his belief here. This is where he gets it from, at least in part. It comes from a dream or a vision that he had. Now, I don't know if this dream came from God. One thing that you see with Job's friends is that many times they have good theology. Job's friend Eliphaz here is quoted by Paul positively in 1 Corinthians. Their theology is good. What they do, though, so terribly, and they don't even know it, is they take good theology and they twist it and they apply it in the wrong way. That's what they do to Job here. Is it right that God punishes the wicked? It is right. Is it right that sometimes our suffering is brought on because of our personal sin? That is right. Is it right that that's always the case? Absolutely not. And it was not the case with Job here. Listen to this dream that Eliphaz has. Now a word was brought to me stealthily, and my ear received a whisper of it. Amid disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men. Again, this could be from God and He's misapplying it. Or this could be like someone who comes up to you and says, you know what, brother or sister, I've got a word from the Lord for you. And you can't convince them otherwise because they think God has spoken to them. Can God speak to us? He can. But we have to be extremely careful about things like that. When deep sleep falls on men, dread came upon me, and trembling, and made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed by my face. The hair of my flesh bristled up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice. And here's what the Spirit or the vision gave him. Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? That's what his friends think about Job. They say, Job, there's no way you're not in sin right now. There's no way you've not done something to bring this on. God would not punish an unjust man. Well, someone tell me, name a few people in the Bible that suffered though they were just people. What's a few names? Peter, he died. Peter died unjustly, yes. Tradition tells us they hung him upside down on a cross. Peter requested that because he did not want to be hung on the cross like Jesus. He wanted to be turned upside down. Paul did certainly, absolutely. Joseph in the Old Testament, sold into slavery. And of course Jesus Christ, the one that Job prefigures, the true innocent sufferer. Look here in chapter 5 of Eliphaz's speech. Let's read a few verses at the beginning. He says to Job, "Call now. Is there anyone who will answer you? And to which of the holy ones will you turn? For anger slays the foolish man." It seems like Eliphaz is at least hinting that Job is a foolish man. What has God said about Job? What did God say about Job? Just, upright, blameless, fearing God, turning away from evil. There's not a man like him on the earth. Here's his friend saying, maybe you're a foolish man, Job. For anger slays the foolish man and jealousy kills the simple. I have seen the foolish taking root, and I cursed his abode immediately. Now listen to this. His sons are far from safety. They are even oppressed in the gate, and there is no deliverer. Is his friend saying? Is his friend talking about Job's children dying right here? Maybe a few weeks or a month after that happened? Talk about compassion. Talk about some friends here. He goes on down, verse 8. But as for me, I would seek God, Job. That's what I would do, Job. Let me tell you what to do. Seek God. And then look in verse 17. Behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. Here's Job. Job wants to die. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, for He inflicts pain and gives relief. He wounds and His hands also heal. Is it true that we should not despise the discipline of the Almighty? Of course that's true. But here's Eliphaz taking a truth, and again, I think trying to twist a round truth into a square peg here for Job and messing it up. So here, what Eliphaz says to Job is this basically. Job, God would not do this to a righteous man. You are unrighteous, Job. You just confess, get back to God. We love you. Turn away from your sins, Job. Make things right. We know you've messed up. Just come back to God. And here's what Job says. First of all, Job talks about his pain. Let's start in chapter 6. Then Job answered, "Oh, that my grief were actually weighed," he says, "and laid in the balances together with my calamity." He says, if you could weigh my grief, and if you could weigh what I've been through, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the seas. Job says, take my grief, take what I have gone through, put it on this side of the scale, put all the sand in the world on this side of the scale, and my grief will outweigh it. Have you ever been like that before? Have you felt that before? He says, therefore my words have been rash. He admits here in verse 3, you know what? I did speak in ways that I shouldn't have spoken. Look in verse 26. Do you intend to reprove my words when the words of one in despair belong to the wind? How many of us have said or thought things before when we were in deep pain? How many of us have injured ourselves horribly and we've said things that we didn't want to say, or someone has hurt us very deeply and we said some things or thought some things? We shouldn't have done that. The fact is, that's what happens when you're in despair, isn't it? We have to realize that. Job is not saying he's right to do that right now, in a true sense, and yet that's what happens. Look in chapter 7. Starting in verse 1. Is not man forced to labor on earth, and are not his days like the days of a hired man? They're long, hard. As a slave who pants for the shade, and as a hired man who eagerly waits for his wages, so am I allotted months of vanity, and nights of trouble are appointed me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? And the night continues, and I am continually tossing until dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and a crust of dirt. There's no modern medicine in that day. His children are dead. His servants are dead. His wife, at least for a moment, has turned her back on him. Who can Job go to? He's got worms on him because of the disease of skin that he has. My skin hardens and runs. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and come to an end without hope. And turn over, or stay in chapter 7 and just look down in verse 17. This is Job speaking to God. Job says to God, "What is man that you magnify him, and that you are concerned about him, that you examine him every morning and try him every moment? Will you never turn your gaze away from me, nor let me alone until I swallow my spittle?" Just give me a break so I can swallow my spit. "Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself?" Have you ever thought or prayed these things? Maybe still in a trusting spirit, but you're opening your heart up to God. God, why are you doing these things to me? Why are you allowing these things to happen to me and my family? Why? "Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me, but I will not be." Now turn back to chapter 6. This is the main thing here, I think, in these 4 chapters, at least that we're going to see tonight, and I hope to have some discussion. But you got Job's friend. He says, "Job, basically you're not innocent. Why don't you just be honest and tell us the sin and tell it to God and be done with this? Job, God wouldn't do this to you, Job, if you hadn't sinned in some terrible way." And then Job talks about his pain and how heavy it is. And the reality is this: in one sense, you can't understand pain until you have experienced it, can you? You can't do it. You can't understand chronic pain unless you've experienced chronic, non-stop pain for weeks, maybe. The emotional, the physical, the spiritual, the intellectual questioning, why is this happening? You really, on one level, you can't understand it. And here is a man who has gone through more than probably all 3 of his friends combined. And what does his friends do at the very beginning? They accuse him of doing wrong. They accuse him of being the problem. They have no sympathy. They have no compassion. And even if Job was to blame, his friends should have had compassion toward him still and been more tender toward him because of everything he had gone through. And here's what Job says, starting in verse 14 of chapter 6. "For the despairing man, there should be kindness from his friend." Job knows he said some things he shouldn't have said. We've looked at that. And the thing that Job needs and wants here is he just wants some compassion and kindness from his friends. He's got nobody else to help him, so that he does not forsake the fear of the Almighty. And now listen to how Job compares his friends to. What does he compare his friends to? He says, "My brothers have acted deceitfully like a wadi." What is a wadi here? Like the torrents of wadis which vanish. What he's speaking of is a riverbed or something, some creek out in the desert perhaps, that sometimes has water. And he talks about travelers coming and they're looking for water, they're thirsty. And, oh, here's a riverbed, there has to be water, and they follow it through. And look down in verse 20. Look in verse 19. "The caravans of Tema looked, the travelers of Sheba hoped for them. They were disappointed, for they had trusted. They came there and were confounded. Indeed, you have become such." He says, "My friends came to me. I saw you coming. I saw you sitting down with me. I thought I'm going to get help. I thought my friends were going to come around me and love me. Yes, speak truth, but be there for me. And what do I find out? You're just like a dried up river to a thirsty man. You've brought nothing to me but more sorrow. You've brought nothing to me. Friends, let us not be friends like this. Amen. When we find people in despair, it may be their fault. But you know what? When you're a man or a woman in despair, you need love and compassion from a friend. The Bible tells us to speak truth in love, doesn't it? That's why I hate when anybody, a Christian or anybody, speaks about homosexuality in such a vile and hateful and mean, joking way, vulgar way. Well, that's great. How are you going to win homosexuals that way? That's not loving the homosexuals. That's not caring for them. We speak what the Bible speaks. But I'm not going to make them the joke, the punchline of my joke. That is a joke. I'm going to care for people. I'm going to love people. You have drug addicts. They don't need to be made fun of. They need to be loved and cared. And here is Job, a righteous man. His friends come and say, "You're the problem, Job. You're the problem." And it hurts him. Look in verse 27 and 28. You would even cast lots for the orphans and barter over your friend. You would see orphans and say, let's cast lots for them. Maybe it means that you don't have enough, you don't even care enough to take them in, so let's just cast lots and see which one has to take. In verse 28, now please look at me, Job says. A man who has lost everything. He says, look at me and see if I lie to your face. Desist now. Let there be no injustice. Even desist. My righteousness is yet in it. Here's a man who is suffering so much pain. There's people who suffer worse than Job. He's suffering so much pain. His friends have come by, giving him a lecture. A false lecture at that. He says, I just want some compassion. I just want somebody to love me. I just need help, guys. That's what he says. Let me ask you all, what different situations in life or what different things in life can bring someone to despair like Job is going through right now? What are some of the different things that can cause this to somebody's life? Loss of a loved one can lead people into depression, despair, different emotional testing there. What else? Allowing someone getting on drugs. Someone getting on drugs and obviously wanting to kill themselves at times, struggling so bad, hating what they're doing, loving what they're doing. They're just an emotional wreck. What else can bring someone to this point? Cancer diagnosis. Bad news physically. I'm not ready to die. I'm not ready to die. I'm too young to die. I'm in too good of shape to die. What else? What about a crisis of faith? You begin to doubt if the Bible's true. The devil comes and assaults you and attacks you. There have been Christians before who had to literally put their hand over their mouth to keep blasphemies from coming out. The devil was tempting them so badly. Anything else comes to mind? Terrible things that people in war have to witness and at times do. I mean, this stuff weighs, doesn't it? It weighs on people. You feel like you're alone sometimes, or you feel embarrassed to tell anybody. That's why we need friends. That's why we need the church. Anything else? What else would bring someone to a point like this? There's a number of things that can can bring people to a point like this. People who come like this and they're in a mental breakdown is another one. We're going to look at something in just a moment about that. But you come to someone despairing, they're suicidal, they're hurt so deeply, they're in so much pain, they want to die. What does that person need at a moment like that? Compassion? He needs truth, doesn't he? But it may be, you take, maybe you're hurting, you hurt yourself, and you go to your medicine cabinet and you've got some Tylenol or ibuprofen or whatever. You don't take the whole bottle, do you? You just take one or whatever it calls for. And if we're not careful, for the most part, our temptation for most people, for most Christians, is not to give enough truth. But sometimes we can give too much truth at once. It's like taking too much medicine. It does harm. Here's a man, Job. He does need truth. But he needs an extra dosage of compassion and love. That's what he needs right now. He just needs someone to take him. Obviously, he's in a different situation. He just needs someone to take him out for breakfast. And to buy his breakfast and say, you know what, I care for you. I don't know why you're going through this, but I know you're a Christian. God has a plan. We trust Him. He's sovereign. I'm here for you. I love you. Here's my number. He just wants somebody to come and to love on him, to care for him. Let me give you an example tonight. Don't turn there, but if you turn to number 175 in your hymn books, you would find the song, "There is a fountain filled with blood." It goes on, talks about drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilt, all their guilty stains. That was written by a man named William Cowper. I think actually you pronounce his name Cooper, though it's written Cowper. William Cooper wrote that song. It's one of the great songs in our hymn books. I absolutely love that song. Before William Cooper was saved, he tried to kill himself 3 times. This is back in the 1700s. He tried to kill himself 3 times. He had a mental breakdown. And then he was converted. He was saved. And I want to pick up reading some from a book. This book is called When Darkness Will Not Lift by John Piper. We actually read it in our book discussion group maybe a couple years ago. Really good small book if you're going through a difficult time. And listened to what the author has to say. After his release from St. Albans, that was a mental institution, an asylum. He got released after he got saved. He got better. Cooper moved in with the Unwin family in a parish near Olney. When the father of the family died, Newton, this is John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, Newton came to console them. Cooper was so helped by what he heard that he and Miss Unwin moved to Olney to be a part of Newton's church. For the next 13 years, Newton tended the tangled garden of Cooper's soul. Cooper said, "A sincere or more affectionate friend no man ever had." While there, Cooper entered a time of spiritual despair that made him feel utterly God-forsaken and lost. This lasted most of the rest of his life until he died in 1800. Now, this is not normal for Christians, but this was Cooper. Mr. Cooper went through this. Again, there were repeated attempts at suicide, and each time God providentially prevented him. Newton stood by him all the way through this, even sacrificing at least one vacation so as not to leave Cooper alone. That was a friend that cared for a man in despair. The book goes on, all this is from the book. The book goes on and talks about how John Newton would move to another church, the pastor, move out of the way, and yet for 20 years, he and William Cooper still wrote letters to each other. He still was cared for his former pastor. What do we see here? John Newton, the man who wrote Amazing Grace, the man who used to be a slave trader. What do we see here is this grace to a Christian who is in despair. John Newton gave him truth after truth, but it was given with the salt of compassion and love. And there are times in our own life, what do we need? We need compassion. And for us, we need to understand when we have a family member or a neighbor or a loved one or somebody in the church, and it hits, when it hits and they're overwhelmed, they need truth. But they need to know we love them. They need to know compassion and kindness. We need to be their friend, is what Job is saying. And that's one of the big lessons we find from this book, is we need friends. We need friends who will tell us the truth. But we need friends who will tell us the truth in love and compassion because they love us. Was there any discussion about this tonight? What are some ways that we as a church can better show compassion to one another and to other people? What are some ways that we can do this as a church and as individuals? We can show up. His friends did that. That was good. They did really well. That was the only thing they did well, though, basically. But yes, to be there. What else? For 7 days, Job and his friends didn't say a word to each other. Or his friends didn't speak to Job, at least. And they were just silent because he was so disturbed and broken. Nothing was spoken. And I read that 7 days is, at least at that time, I suppose, was the time for a funeral, basically. So maybe his friends were saying, "You're like you're dead to us." Or maybe this is more likely, his friends were just, they saw his distress. There's just no words that could be spoken. I'm just going to be here for you. So that was really good. That was really good for his friends to do that. What about not judging someone's motives? That's a good thing, isn't it? You see someone doing something good. We might be tempted to think, you know what, that person's doing that just because they want to get noticed. We have no idea, do we? Or we see someone do something that's unpleasant to us and we say, you know what, that person did that to get under my skin. We have no idea why they're doing things. And when somebody gets into something, we have no idea the motives that led them into despair, led them into hurt. We don't know. You know, it's like a hospital. There's policies, at least in other countries, maybe even here, that are talking about not allowing certain people into the emergency room if they've not been vaccinated and stuff like that. I think vax mandates are insane, by the way. I'm not talking about the vaccine. I'm just talking about mandates. I think that's insane for our country to go down that road. But a hospital sees someone's hurt, and they're really, really bad. The doctors don't come out and say, "Now, how did you get hurt?" Or they don't come out to say, "Now, why did you get hurt?" "Oh, you did something dumb. We can't help you here. I'm sorry." And for us as Christians, we see someone in great pain. It may be their fault, and we may need to address that. But you know what? We come to that person and say, "I love you. I care for you. I'm going to help you no matter what. Are you willing to be helped? Then here I am. I want to help you." And I would say, and probably close on this, unless you all have something to add to this. How do we have compassion on people? It's by keeping our heart warm by God's love. That's how we have compassion on people. Do you know when I love people the most? It's when I love God the most and I know that He loves me the most. When I know that God loves me and that I love Him, I can love anybody. And for us, we need to keep our hearts warm in God's love. Was there any other discussion about this tonight? All right. May the Lord bless you. And may, when times like this come to people close to us, may we be found to be good friends. And may we be found to have good friends when we go through times like this.